A console can die twice. First, the manufacturer pulls the plug. Later, one final game appears on a store shelf, sometimes months after the funeral, sometimes years. For 7 failed systems, those last releases became accidental epitaphs. If you want to explore the final games that sealed these consoles' fates, subscribe to Cartridge Graveyard. One ended by turning Tetris into a headache. Another survived through a game about cartoon worms. But the strangest refused to stay dead for almost 6 years. Its final game arrived as Apple prepared the first iPhone, and the reason it survived that long changes what failure really means. Nintendo's Virtual Boy was supposed to make 3-dimensional gaming personal. Instead, players hunched over a red plastic visor balanced on 2 fragile legs, stared into monochrome graphics, and often emerged rubbing their eyes. Nintendo launched it in Japan on July 21, 1995, but weak sales forced stores to cut the price within months. Only 22 games were officially released worldwide. The final one was 3D Tetris, released exclusively in North America on March 22, 1996. The title sounds inevitable. What better way to prove a 3-dimensional console than with the world's most recognizable puzzle game? But 3D Tetris did not simply drop flat blocks. Players looked down into a virtual well and rotated chunky shapes across 3 axes. The original Tetris communicated everything in a glance. Find the gap, rotate the piece, complete the line. This version needed perspective grids and wireframe guidance just to show where a block would land, so the Virtual Boy's final game repeated the machine's central mistake. Nintendo had taken an accessible pleasure and added depth, complexity, and physical discomfort. The console designed to reveal the future finished by making one of gaming's cleanest ideas difficult to read. That was a bad farewell, but at least it reached the country where the Virtual Boy was still breathing. Sega's 32X ended more painfully because customers already knew they had purchased the wrong future. The 32X launched in late 1994 as a mushroom-shaped attachment for the Sega Genesis. 99 in the United States required its own power supply and promised 32-bit performance without forcing players to abandon their existing console. But Sega was also preparing the Saturn, so developers faced a brutal question. Why build for an add-on attached to aging hardware when Sega's real next-generation machine was already coming? The game that could have answered that question arrived too late. Dark Side, developed by Frontier Developments and released in Europe in 1996, was a space shooter filled with texture-mapped asteroids, alien ships, and enormous explosions. Technically, it was exactly the kind of showcase the 32X needed at launch, but it appeared near the end, in one region, with a tiny production run. That scarcity created a cruel reversal. Complete copies can now sell for hundreds or even thousands of dollars, not because millions love Darkside, but because almost nobody had the chance to buy it. The 32X promised affordable access to the next generation, yet its last game became an expensive artifact for a handful of collectors. Darkside proved that rarity can preserve a game's price, but price alone cannot preserve a living audience. For that, abandoned hardware needs people stubborn enough to keep using it. And Atari's Jaguar found exactly that. Atari had advertised the Jaguar as the world's first 64-bit console, but its unusual multi-chip architecture was difficult to program. Its controller resembled a telephone keypad, and its software library never gained enough momentum. Atari discontinued the system in 1996 after selling roughly 125,000 units. That should have silenced it. But Telegames specialized in supporting hardware that larger publishers had abandoned. So in 1998, 2 years after Atari left the console business, Jaguar owners received worms. There is something almost perfect about that image. The supposedly powerful 64-bit Predator ended with tiny cartoon worms taking turns firing bazookas across destructible hills. Worms was already successful elsewhere, and the Jaguar version did not reinvent it. But its existence revealed something Darkside's collector value could not. A small audience could keep dead hardware commercially useful. The Jaguar failed to conquer the market, but players who refused to clear space beneath their televisions gave it an afterlife. Failure, it turned out, did not require silence, but a loyal audience can sustain only so much. Nintendo's 64DD tried to build its entire identity around people connecting, creating, and returning over time. That made its final release more ambitious than Worms, and far lonelier. The disk drive attachment sat beneath the Nintendo 64 and used writable magnetic disks. Nintendo imagined persistent worlds, user-created content, online connectivity, and games that could evolve after purchase. Those ideas sound ordinary now, But in the mid-1990s, they were ambitious enough to suggest a different future for consoles. Delays destroyed that future's timing. Nintendo announced the 64DD years before release, but it did not reach Japan until December 1999, distributed through a RANnet subscription package. By that point, Nintendo 64 cartridges had grown larger, the Dreamcast was already online, and anticipation had curdled into indifference. Fewer than 15,000 units were reportedly sold, with only 10 discs released. The last was Japan Pro Golf Tour 64 on May 2, 2000. Players could create golfers, develop their abilities, and enter network-supported competitions. So the final disc quietly delivered the machine's original promise: connected play, stored progress, and an experience shaped by long-term participation. But a network becomes valuable only when other people are inside it. With fewer than 15,000 systems sold, every social feature also exposed the empty seats. Japan Pro Golf Tour 64 was not merely rare, it was a country club completed after most of the members had cancelled. The 64DD died because its community never reached critical mass. Neo Geo Pocket Color was more frustrating, because it had good hardware, strong games, and enthusiastic owners. What it lacked was enough time. SNK's handheld offered a crisp color screen, excellent battery life, and a small clicky joystick still praised by fighting game fans. But it entered a market dominated by Nintendo's Game Boy Color. Just as Pokémon transformed handheld gaming into a cultural force no smaller competitor could escape, so when SNK collapsed financially, international games disappeared from stores, even though the machine itself still had creative momentum. Japan received one final major release on September 13, 2001. SNK vs. Capcom. Card Fighters 2 Expand Edition. The game combined characters from both companies in a strategic card battler containing hundreds of cards. More importantly, it expanded the original instead of shrinking its ambitions around dying hardware, but it remained exclusive to Japan, so Western fans spent years relying on guides and, later, fan translations to understand it. That makes Card Fighters 2 more painful than a bad farewell. It showed what continued Neo Geo Pocket support might have become. The system did not end because it had exhausted its best ideas. It ended because SNK exhausted its money. Sometimes a final game confirms why a console failed. Card Fighters 2 did the opposite. It revealed the future that had just been cancelled. Good ideas, however, are not enough if using the machine feels like a negotiation. Nokia had the money SNK lacked, the global reach the 64DD never achieved, and the technology to build a portable online platform. But the N-Gage stumbled over tiny physical rituals that Nintendo and Sony understood far better. The original N-Gage launched in 2003 for $299. To change a game, owners had to remove the back cover, take out the battery, swap the game card, and rebuild the device in their hands. Holding it like a normal phone, place the speaker along its edge, producing the infamous sideways taco phone pose. The jokes were devastating, but Nokia kept trying. It redesigned the hardware as the N-Gage QD, reduced the price, and funded games far more ambitious than the platform's reputation suggested. One of the final original N-Gage releases was Payload in 2006, a vehicular combat game set across futuristic arenas. Payload represented what Nokia wanted the platform to become: three-dimensional action, wireless competition, and console-style experiences carried in a pocket. But by 2006, Nintendo's DS and Sony's PSP had established identities that could be explained in seconds. The DS offered touch controls and Nintendo characters. The PSP was a sleek portable multimedia machine. The N-Gage was still asking customers whether it was a phone that played games or a game system that made calls, so its failure was not caused by a lack of technology. It was caused by accumulated friction. Every extra step between wanting to play and actually playing weakened the promise of convenience. Nokia had imagined the future of mobile gaming, but it made that future feel like work. By this point, the pattern seems clear. A final game might expose flawed hardware, arrive too late, depend on an empty network, or reveal ideas killed by bankruptcy. Once the company leaves and retailers clear the shelves, the story should be over. But one console broke that pattern so completely that its commercial death became the reason it survived. Sega discontinued the Dreamcast in 2001. Its failure forced Sega to abandon console manufacturing after nearly 2 decades. Developers moved to rival machines, retailers cleared their remaining stock, and the final assembly line stopped. By every normal definition, the Dreamcast was finished. But Japanese arcade developers saw something the mass market did not: The Dreamcast shared important technology with Sega's Naomi arcade hardware, so certain arcade games could be converted relatively cheaply. More importantly, the remaining audience was small but intensely loyal. Publishers no longer needed millions of buyers. A carefully produced run aimed at dedicated shooter fans could still make financial sense. That smaller audience did not merely keep the Dreamcast quiet, it kept the official release calendar moving. On March 8, 2007, Milestone released Curiosities, a dark vertical shooter whose name means crow in Japanese. Players guided a ship through gray industrial skies, switching between guns, swords, and shields that became stronger through use. It was officially licensed, pressed onto Dreamcast GD-ROMs, and released almost 6 years after Sega announced the console's end. By that morning, the Xbox 360 had been available for more than a year. The PlayStation 3 and Wii were already on the market. Apple had announced the first iPhone 2 months earlier and was preparing to place it in stores. Curiosities did not appear because Sega rescued the Dreamcast. It appeared because Sega no longer controlled what the Dreamcast had to mean. The mass audience moved on, so the machine no longer had to compete for everyone. A smaller community transformed failed hardware into a home, and commercial death removed the pressure that had once defined success. These consoles did not end with dramatic explosions. They faded through discounted boxes, empty servers, and final cases placed on shelves where almost nobody noticed them. But inside each case was proof that someone kept working after the world looked away, and sometimes being remembered by a few is more meaningful than being briefly wanted by millions. Which failed console do you think deserved one more game? Share the machine you would bring back, and if you enjoy uncovering the forgotten human stories behind gaming history, stay with us for the next one.